Good evening. I'm David Kataforis, professor and chair of the Art History Department at the University of Kansas. I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were progressively forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This land acknowledgement recognizes that Native Americans are traditional guardians of the land and recognizes the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second lecture in our series, Intersections of Identity, Expression, Exchange, and Hybridity. The series asks what constitutes identity and how do people navigate, form, and reform their sense of self? And how can the study of art and its history help us to consider the diverse identities expressed by visual culture and its creators? We seek to amplify the voices of scholars and artists whose work explores individual and collective identities as those intersect with notions of the body, disability, gender, heritage, and race. The series is organized by KU's Crest Foundation Department of Art History and our History of Art graduate students' Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. It is sponsored by the Franklin Murphy Lecture Fund. We present it in partnership with the Spencer Museum of Art, KU Department of Visual Art, Lawrence Art Center, Lawrence Public Library, Raven Bookstore, Black Lawrence, and many other community partners. I want to thank Art History Department Office Manager Lisa Clore for all of her organizational help and acknowledge the creator of the poster for this evening's lecture, KU student Aaron Begay. Now I'll introduce our speaker. Carmen Lane is a two-spirit, African-American and Haudenosaunee Mohawk Tuscarora artist, writer, and facilitator living in Cleveland, Ohio. Lane's work ranges from experiential educator to diversity practitioner to organizational systems consultant to experimental artist. All of it integrates ancestry, legacy, and spirituality, pursues expansion, experimentation, and play. Lane is founder and director of ATNSC, Center for Healing and Creative Leadership, an urban retreat center and social practice experiment in holistic health, leadership development, indigenous arts and culture, and the Aksota Gallery located in the historic Buckeye Shaker neighborhood. Lane's work has been published in numerous journals and anthologies, including the Yellow Medicine Review, Red Ink Magazine, Anomaly, and the Lambda Literary Award nominated Sovereign Erotics, a collection of two-spirit literatures. Lane's first collection of poetry is Calling Out After Slaughter from 2015. Lane exhibited work in the Front International Cleveland Triennial 2018 group show by Michael Rakowitz, A Color Removed at Spaces Gallery, and at EFA Project Spaces Spring 2019 exhibition In the Presence of Absence. Lane was a 2018 Creative Fusion Artist in Residence and recipient of the 2019 Room in the House Artist Residency at the historic Karamu Theater. In 2020, Lane was awarded a Joyce Award with the ATNSC Center for Healing and Creative Leadership. Lane holds a BA from Earlham College in Women's Studies and an MS in Organization Development and Change from American University. Lane was a recipient of both the AUNTL Siegel Seashore Fellowship and the Hal Kellner Award. Lane is an Amanda Fowler Scholar member of the NTL Institute for Applied Behavioral Science and Wordcraft Circle of Native Writers and Storytellers. In 2016, they became a birth, postpartum, and end-of-life doula. Carmen Lane's talk this evening is entitled Unfinished, We Are What's Left Undone, Identity, Performative Racial Scripts, and the Necessity of the Anti-Colonial Iconoclast. After their talk, we will have a question and answer session moderated by a member of the Graduate Students Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee. So please type your questions into the YouTube chat box during the lecture and following the lecture, and the moderator will read the questions to our speaker who will address them. So even though they can't hear you, please put your hands together for Carmen Lane, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you, David, for the introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this community and this important lecture series. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides, and then I'll say a little bit more about what we're going to talk about this evening. So the name of this talk is Unfinished. We are what's left undone. And so I'm going to suggest that we are all unfinished, and we are all what's left undone of these conditions that we find ourselves being concerned about in the here and now, that we are a part of, contribute to, and the solution through our practice as artists, as educators, as catalysts for change. I want to invite us to think about our own stories, our own practice, and the potentiality of what it means for us to gather in community, even in a virtual space, to think about how we collectively bring a presence that is required for the change and shifts in our world that our world is asking us to produce through our individual and collective purpose right here and right now. I'm going to start with these two images of my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, Vivian and Paul. My grandmother was a school teacher, an educator, and my grandfather was a postal worker in a neighborhood in Cleveland called Glenville. They both were from small towns in Ohio, Steubenville, where my grandmother was born, and she was raised in Lorain, Ohio. She was the first African-American student to be enrolled in the National Honor Society. She was the first student of color to be allowed in the North to participate in extracurricular activities. That while she attended school with white people and white students, that students of color were not allowed to have avocations, were not allowed to develop beyond the basic access to learning. My grandfather was a World War II veteran and an industrial arts student at Kent State University. Both of my grandparents were creative people. My grandfather was an artist, my grandmother was a poet, and in their lifetimes were not able to be artists in the sense of having a professional life that was rooted and grounded in their creative practice. So I named them to say that my practice is not singular. It is a collaborative practice that engages with and includes the creative imaginations of my relatives, of my ancestors. And so they too are a part of this conversation that you're hearing from me. With that, I'm going to share a story with you. One of the materials that is essential in my practice is grief and mourning. That it isn't something that gets evoked in me, but it is a material that I use in the construction of my work as an installation artist, as a writer, in the experiments that I do in the context of social practice. That the themes that are unfinished in my family system, in my family line, in the historical moments in which my relatives lived, that there is a responsibility and an important use of that story in service of the contemporary cultural production in my practice. To the left of the screen is my great-grandmother, and to the right is my grandfather. This is the grandfather. This is the image of him that I recall from my childhood. One part of my story is that I was a caregiver for both my grandparents at the end of their lives. So I supported them ending and completing themselves in the way that they wanted to as human beings. My grandparents were divorced, so these were two separate projects, and each project had its own learnings. And I'll share a little bit more about that. But one of the things my grandfather said to me when he, invited me to partner with him at the end of his life was that I would learn something from partnering with him. And he said it as a person who had dementia. And so I take that as he could distill in concrete ways kind of the core root of the moment of what needed to be expressed. And that also informs who I am and how I do my work as an artist and how I do myself in the world with others. So I hold this polarity that this woman, my great grandmother, gave birth to my grandfather, and I was present with my grandfather at the moment of his last breath and when his heart stopped. And so for me, this is a significant polarity in my life that I access on a regular basis as an artist and as a human being. The focus of this engagement with you this evening is to really think about what are the responsibilities inherent in carrying unfinished ancestral business in one's body, in the ecosystem of one's environment, individually and collectively. So at the group level, I think of myself, what are my responsibilities as a person of African descent, as an Indigenous person, as Haudenosaunee, in a raced system that has perpetually used race to disconnect, to fragment me from my humanity. And our human experience is paradoxically what gives us the ability to have an art practice. So for the white viewer, there's a group level collective responsibility in addition to our individual family of origin, our cultural and ethnic relationships to what we carry into the here and now, into the present moment, seen and unseen. One of the ways in which I do my work as an installation artist is creating altars that come out of Indigenous and in Black, Indigenous, Afro-Atlantic spiritual traditions. And so for me, the altar becomes a spatial gateway between the seen and the unseen, between the work itself and the audience. That is, there's a communication that occurs between my work and the viewer that is not the same communication with the next viewer. My intent may not be what happens once this work is installed. It may become something else. It may serve another purpose. When I think about the title of this talk, and when I think about what I mean by race as a construct that is performative, that there's a raced self that has to distinguish itself from the conditioning of the system, from the expectations of the system, and what is the role of the artist in this? It is often the primary lens for viewing and meaning making in our culture. And again, what is the function and purpose of art? To disrupt or to no longer, to disentangle the viewer and the audience from these scripts that were given that perpetuate and sustain this experiment that we call America. That these ideologies are both an attractor and a form of resistance in how we move towards or against our understandings of race, racism, and white supremacy. That I am arguing that race, and particularly Black bodies, are both the glue and the lifeblood in this experiment. That anything that happens to a Black body in this culture is a part of what reinforces our current realities. So whether I am alive or whether I am dead, it is still a material that this system uses to reproduce itself. Our attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, aesthetics are reifying forces of this status quo. And so the function of art is to question those conditioned roles and expectations, those archetypes that we embody if we do not investigate our particularity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about identity politics, intersectionality as a framework for meaning making, and the paradoxical nature of contemporary art, right? And its possibilities. And what does it mean for an artist to develop and nurture a heretical art practice that isn't bound to or reacting to the expectations of what we call the art world? I want to start with, what do I mean when I say unfinished business? And I forgot to start the timer for me because I talk a lot and I want to make sure you have time to engage with me. So I'm an artist and I'm a applied behavioral scientist. And so one of the ways that I support myself in my practice is I think about human systems and the potential of what the work can do as an intervention in human systems. Fritz Perls is the founder of Gestalt therapy. So I'm not going to talk about these concepts from a therapeutic context, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of race, ethnicity, identity, and the role of the artist. And so Fritz Perls suggests that the major tensions that we have as human beings that get disrupted and catalyze a need for therapy are these 6 areas: lack of contact or no social support, confluence, meaning the environment takes control and blends with you, fragmentation, that is a denied or fragmented self, conflicting values and expectations, polarities, which is never seen gray, only black and white, and my favorite, unfinished business, the inability to gain closure. So if we think about this in the context of race, in the context of systems of oppression, and we bump this individual kind of distress to the notion of oppression, that these conditions contribute to ongoing stress and distress, that the system is constructing this as a tool and strategy to oppress. And I'm arguing that art and the function of the artist, and in particular, artists of color, have the potential in our practice and in our work to disrupt and fill in the gaps of these fragmentations, or to distinguish ourselves from the environment. That for my grandparents, that this lack of contact, that the environment wasn't engaging with them, that it diminished their capacities to become artists, to have a practice, that the environment objectified them, and that in a contemporary context, this environment makes objects out of Black artists, out of Indigenous artists, and that our job, our role, our function is to be heretical in the sense that we break out of the adages of what an artist, that what we're told an artist is, and to function through our practice in a way that supports the what is outside of the social construct, that we explore the gray of identity, that we move outside of racial binaries, that we go back to thinking about the histories that have been fragmented or disrupted in our own stories and imagine how to bring those, to close those gaps and to heal the rifts embedded in who we are, who we believe ourselves to be with others, to figure out how to gain closure, which means it can catalyze something new in our work, in our world. Something new can be evoked and provoked with our work. I'm going to give you some other things to consider before I move into showing you some of my work. Kurt Lewin was a social psychologist. He was a Polish Jew and refugee scholar that was given access to America because of his educational background. And he fled Poland because of his understanding of what was happening in a way that others weren't quite ready to see yet. And so he developed a body of knowledge based on his experience in a system that was murdering people based on arbitrary characteristics. And he was observing people who had individual core values and beliefs, and yet their behaviors still colluded with the environment. And so he became interested in thinking about how people can learn how to see the forces around them and intervene in a way that was distinguishing and could shift and change that environment. He had a very fundamental understanding of the use and function of theories. And he said, there's nothing more practical as a good theory. And so I'm going to argue that there's nothing so practical, right, as the function of art to intervene, to reflect, to crack open. So Kurt Lewin says that he has a formula for behavior, that behavior is the function of the person in the environment. That is, the containers and the conditions we create inform the behaviors of the person. And the person is simply how I see and understand myself in the environment. And so when I do installation work, when I create altars in a museum, in a site-specific context, I'm thinking about this formula. I'm thinking about the intervention. I'm imagining what are the conditions that I need to create in my practice and in the work to catalyze distinguishing and a distinguishing experience for others. In the context of social practice, people, the phrase or the methodology of a lived practice in some sense reflects what I'm talking about, and in some ways is still not enough. A lived practice examines the reciprocal relationship of art and life. That is, artist practitioners are shaped by their experience, and they in turn create and enhance the experience of others. So I'm going to push against that, because for me, that gives the artist an out to not be responsible for the conditions or the environment that they make and create in their work. That the social hierarchy of artists gives us permission to do what we want to do, no matter what the impact is. And I reject that. And I reject that as someone who has so many social group identities that are marginalized within this particular system and the structure in that system, that the function and purpose and role and responsibilities inherent in being an artist are much higher given those conditions, that the cost has a different meaning. And so for me, this work is about the reciprocal relationship between art and the standpoint of the artist to be able to see and take in what others cannot see and take in. This is a work that I love, and at the same time, I'm not so sure how successful it was. This piece is an altar to Elegua and to Emmett Till and to Mamie Till. I called in my role as the artist, these ancestors to honor them and to support a contemporary conversation that a group of artists were in around the murder of Tamir Rice. The exhibition was called A Color Removed, and my friend and colleague, Michael Rakowitz, experimented with this notion of removing the color orange from the environment because the environment was suggesting that a 12-year-old African-American boy, that it was his own fault that the police murdered him because the orange tip on a BB gun was removed. And so as someone invited to join another artist in a conversation, not just a group show, but a group intervention in the environment, what did I want to offer to support that? And so for me, any murder of an African-American person, of a Native person by the police is unfinished business. It's an example of the inability for Native people, for Black people to get closure around the levels of fugitivity that we have in a system that has either wanted us to labor for it or to erase us from it. And so for me, the altar then becomes part of a visual culture of breaking through a need to make something invisible and making it exceedingly visible. And so that's why I say I'm not so sure that this particular piece is successful, because it says "fuck Dana Schutz" on it, and rarely does anyone notice. So this piece is also reflecting the teachings and qualities of Elegua as a Yoruba Orisha. And it's speaking to the art worlds, and particularly Black artists need to use their bodies to cover up Dana Schutz's work called Open Casket. That for me, what the ancestors are telling us is that our job is to simply do our work and let our work speak for itself. That the distraction of race, as Toni Morrison aptly put, distracts artists of color, Black and Indigenous artists, from simply having a practice when we are being tasked with responding to inaccurate and mediocre art interventions, simply just to provoke. rather than evoke feeling, understanding, clarity, expansive ways of being in the here and now. What I love about this work are some of the elements that seem to repeat in my practice. The yellow that you see is a water-soluble body bag. And I use that material with the intention of evoking, in a contemporary context, Emmett Till's not murder, but how his body was handled by being thrown in a river. And so if a body has been found in water, this is the material used to both collect that body and allow the water to remove itself. So there are tiny holes in this bag. And what was interesting to me about the water-soluble body bag is that the color of it is yellow. And it's a similar yellow ochre that Dana used in the open casket. And so it made me wonder a very fundamental thing. In the context of unfinished business, the ancestors seem to do whatever work is required. And can I, as the artist, get out of its way, get out of their way, and to be of service in the deep listening that is required in my practice? The title of this work is called Chopa Alegwatil, the nigger that did the talking, because it was a myth that Emmett Wolf whistled, but it is the truth that when the white men stormed into his family's home looking for him, the white man asked, where's that nigger that did the talking? And a quality of Alegwa is the talkative one. The word Chopa is Choctaw for afraid. And Emmett Till was murdered on the Choctaw lands. And so I wanted to name that potential communication that happened between Emmett and the land. This is an image of preparation for a work, a second work that I did in that group exhibition, because I wanted to also put the context of how this system treats Black and brown bodies in a historical context. So this work is about my great-grandmother, Alice Copes Lane. When she died, the funeral home lied about cremating her body and left it in a body bag in a garage for several years. A film crew was scouting location and found her. The meaning that was made of her decaying body was that she was white, and therefore there was a news story about her perceived white body being found at an old Black funeral home. And so my grandmother overheard her mother's name while brushing her teeth over the television news, and understood that this white body that they thought they had found and discovered was actually her mother. And so this work is nothing but unfinished business. The stories of the impact of that moment has traveled through my family line on how we make meaning around death and dying. And so art has been the medium in which I've been able to wrestle with that, to heal it, and to create opportunities for closure for myself and for my relatives. So one of the things that I said earlier is that I come from a family of artists who were never able to become professional artists. And so in this work, Ganazage Gazone, on my tongue, on my back, family tree, acknowledges and includes the work of my relatives. So the poetry of my grandmother is cited on this altar. The crochet work of my great grandmother that you saw earlier, the saxophone of a great uncle, the roller skates of a relative who attempted to desegregate a roller skating rink in the late 1890s, and other objects, so that this work is truly a collaborative work. I also want to point out, and I didn't do that earlier, that this is the time of year when we feast our dead. And so it seems appropriate, an appropriate synchronicity, that this invitation and this talk and this work that I do, that we're together this week having this conversation in a public context. My practice is often based on dreams, and more specifically, receiving an image of a completed work. And then my task as the artist is to figure out how to bring that into this world, to construct it, to make it real, to create the bridge between, which resonates for me as a two-spirit person. So another material that I often use is a door or a doorway or a piece of a door or the suggestion of a doorway. So this is an example of my kind of bringing that image into this world in terms of kind of how I use the function and purpose of a thumbnail sketch. And this is the install at EFA Project Space for the In the Presence of Absence exhibition. Jillian Steinhauer was the curator. And I bring up this exhibition because the whole theme of it was grief and mourning. And so my grandmother had recently passed. And this for me was an invitation to complete some unfinished business for her. And she died at 95 years of age, and felt on some level that this environment, right, that she engaged in confluence with the environment, that it would not allow her, the environment would not allow her to distinguish herself or be seen and understood. And this is something that resonates in me, in my own work, in my own life, in my practice. And so I wanted to acknowledge the journey that I had with her at the end of her life, to close out the part of my life as a caregiver. It had been a 7-year journey, and to offer gratitude from what I perceive and understand as the ancestors, including my grandmother as an ancestor, supporting me in deepening and expanding my art practice. So this is also important for me to engage in this conversation with you as an offering of gratitude. So this is the completed work, Agzo, or Grandma, This is a New Experience. The image on the left is the first day of my grandmother's entry into hospice, in which she said to me, "This is a new experience, knowing I'm about to pass away." And it stunned me, the plainness in which she spoke those words to me. So part of this install was also including her poetry. Part of the process of this install was not shipping the work, that I drove it in my car from Cleveland to New York. That part of the process of completing this work was having her join me on the journey for the exhibition. The image on the right is my grandmother shortly after she passed away. And so she stopped breathing first, and two hospice nurses came in to the room to attempt to declare her time of death, and they could not because her heart was still beating. And so they had to wait 30 minutes for her heart to stop beating. That is significant to me, and I experience it as a communication between my grandmother and those from my family who were present with her. And so this work is really acknowledging the container and the environment of unfinished business, of entering the process of birthing oneself out of your body. It also is a gesture of acknowledging my grandmother joining into a line of others who came before her, her mother, the other mothers before her, who she's joining, and offerings and providing offerings for the in-between space between here and there. This is a drawing that my nephew did last year. He's 5, and he drew this when he was 4. And I wanted to include this in this conversation because unfinished business finds a way to talk to you. And so my nephew never saw this work. He never saw the work, and he never saw his great-grandmother die. His last interaction with her was playing at a tennis court with her while she watched him enjoy and discover and explore the environment. And so when I saw this image that he drew, and both its parody and its difference, this for me is a part of the materials that I need in order to move forward in my practice, to think about and get clear, to think about and to get clear on what I need to develop internally and externally for the next phase of work, and is a reminder that I'm not making this work on my own, that I am in forever infinite collaboration. And when I engage with museums and galleries, there are protocols of care for my work that are at a higher level of need than a simple gallery instruction. And that my practice and my work is an invitation to be in relationship between the artist and the environment in order to create the best potential circumstances and container, and to take seriously what it means to steward a space in which an artist's practice becomes a vehicle for meaning making for an audience. This is a site-specific work I did in an abandoned home around the subject of missing and murdered Indigenous and Black women. This is an example of where the environment itself was talking to me about what I needed to make work about. There had been several women of color whose bodies were found in advanced decay in abandoned homes in Cleveland. And I often like to pick or quote unquote choose spaces to install work that others reject, that others don't want to put their work in because it's not the most visible space, or it's not sought after. So I shared with you an image of my grandfather, and as an industrial artist and as a granddad, he would take me into his wood shop in the basement of his home. And it was my home at the time that he shared with me. And he would give me discarded scraps of wood while he worked on his projects, and gave me a toolbox. And he set me up in my own workspace so that I could imagine. And so for me, one of the things I'm aware of in my work and in how I do my work, I cannot start a project until I find something discarded, something that nobody doesn't want, in order to begin to make something new. So one of the things that was present in this space were 11 hooks. And those hooks got my attention. They are, if you look in the upper right corner, you can see 4 of them. In the city of Cleveland, 11 Black women were murdered by a serial killer who was African American. And so his race became more curious to people than their deaths. And so this was an opportunity for me to provide some kind of closure at the community level, not speaking for these women, but simply what's the container that can catalyze an audience to both feel, grieve, and move on. This also references my great-grandmother, again, because I also like to think about the cumulative impact of moments in spaces. So what does it mean to continue not to attend to something? How much unfinished business can there be before there is a deep dysfunction and sickness in the environment? And what are our responsibilities to attend to those layers? So again, for some reason, playing with body bags has become an experiment for me. And I don't know when I'll be finished with it. But this color blue is what's used when FEMA needs multiple body bags for an occasion. And so I was invited to, in a residency, to do work around data visualization, which is usually kind of a digital context. And so I wanted to strip down this notion of graphs and pie charts that shared terrible data about race, and and certain conditions. So in Cleveland, Black women, Cleveland is the worst city for Black women to live in. Native people are rarely included in any data collection or may be referenced in other or labeled white or, because they're Native and Latinx, there's some erasure continuing to happen. And so this work is around infant mortality and race in Cuyahoga County, in which 14 out of 1,000 births lead to in death for African American families. And so this work is called Amala, She Could Not Stay in Their Black Bodies. And so it is both a data visualization for a contemporary context and a reference to my own loss, having had a miscarriage as a teenager. So there's two kinds of data being displayed in this work. The zip codes that have the highest infant mortality in the county, which are represented by these bundles of wildflowers that I gathered. And then the cradle boards. Now, these aren't functional cradle boards. They're gestures to an Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee design for cradle boards. So it's also suggesting that in the absence of tradition, the risk of infant mortality or the social construct of race and the erasure of culture and tradition is a contributing factor to infant mortality. So this is a memorial to those seen and unseen who fill up these data points. I also do sound work with my installations. And so I wanted to play some of a piece called Birth in the Mourning. And this is going to be an experiment because I'm concerned about whether or not I can then return to the slideshow after I hit play. So we're going to try this. Birth in the morning. The babies. She came in love forged in quiet violence. So did he. The oceans, the salty Atlantic. Why did she want to stay? Why couldn't she stay? Why did you follow me? It was April. It was the water. The water wanted to enter the womb, but it was dry. Is dry. It's dry. Apologies. We'll be back shortly. So I'm going to invite some questions right now, David, while I get this back up. Here we go. Mm. So someone asked a question around synthesizing applied behavioral science with my practice. So for me, in order to do work as an artist, I have to understand not just what I want to make work about, but I need to understand human beings. And so, one of the things that applied behavioral science can do for me in my practice is it gets me clean and clear about what it means to create an environment, what it means to intervene in a way that's ethical, and what it means to make an intervention that matches my intent with its potential impact. It also supports and deepens my understanding of group process and how to bring people together and how to bring people together in a way that's safe enough to experiment. And so, one of those experiments for me is the project that David mentioned in his introduction of me, which is called ATNSC, not ATNSC, but ATNSC Center for Healing and Creative Leadership. Um, so to your right, you see an image. It's a digital print on Japanese kozo paper. Um, it's a it's the center. Tonsil is centered in a residential space. So this home was slated for demolition, and I acquired it through a grant to create an artist-run space that is both a retreat and residency space in a historically um, neglected community. And it's 2 blocks from where I am talking to you on this video. A Tonsil is a duplex that has a mixed use variance. Historically, it's sited in a place where there was a Hungarian population, and then as a result of white flight, became an African American neighborhood. And then it was acquired by the local land bank. And then my arts and culture project um, entered the space. Um, and so I'm calling it a place reclamation project. And what I mean by that is that rather than to use arts and culture to erase a history, that the project is being used to excavate a history. Um, this is what it looks like now. Um, so there is a garden in the front yard that is all indigenous native plants to Ohio and the Great Lakes region. It was designed by um, a family. Well, it was designed by Levi Marshall, but his mother also kind of supported him in the work. And so his family are Meludgeons in Southeast Ohio. And they are African American and Indigenous and European of that origin. So a Creole community in Ohio. And so it was important to me to learn through the process of this project that it is calling us as Indigenous people to the space and place of the potential for correction and healing. This home had restrictions on it that are 105 years old, that were put on it to prevent Black and Jewish people to move into the neighborhood. And so for me, in order for this project to be alive and have a meaning beyond the people who come, the artists who come, the people who enjoy it, is that that history has to be named and publicked in some way. There is a gallery sited in the 2-car garage on the property called Oxo Gallery, in honor of my grandmother. Um, and so artists and it centers Black and Indigenous contemporary art. And so artists can be in residence, live, work, and exhibit work in a neighborhood. And so for me, this is the experiment. This is where the intersection of my practice as an applied behavioral scientist and as a visual artist come together, because it's also an invitation for those two practices to be experimented with on site through deep experiential learning with artists, with community members, with civic leaders who are wrestling with notions of place, the use of art, and designing and planning in communities of color. I may share that with you if we have enough time, but this is a video work that I created during the pandemic after the murder of George Floyd. I want to hold some space for question Q&A, and if we have time, I'll share it with you before we close out our time. I also want to say that for me, my thinking around all of this is through the lens of a lifelong learner. So it's still growing and expanding and changing for me. And that this is just a moment in time and a moment in where my practice currently is. And so for me, I want to invite questions that push me to an edge, but also questions that these are my answers for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lane. Carmen, excuse me. Thank you, Carmen, for that really rich, fascinating, deeply personal talk. What you said near the beginning of your talk about making altars and putting things into them that you're not sure necessarily that the person encountering it will receive. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to do when I can is track people's experience of my work. And so one of the things that I notice is some people feel nothing when they encounter the work, and other people report back that their whole lives have been changed, or that they feel indicted, or they felt their ancestors, or they felt held. So I'm aware that while the work may have one intention in terms of a subject matter or subjectivity, that I really don't have control over so this what the altar is communicating to the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
And why. And it's not my business to know why.
So you want to give the viewer their own space and their own possibility of making meaning too.
Yes, that is of utmost importance in my practice. Thank you, David, for naming that.
Thank you, Carmen. We have a lot of great questions, and I'll let Haley, who's one of our graduate student moderators, read some to you. If Haley, if you want to come on in the room.
Oh, David, I think it might be me.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel.
That's okay. Thank you very much for that just wonderful talk and for sharing your insight and experiences. This is a question from one of my colleagues here, Michael, who asked for Chopa Aleguatil and similar pieces. Could you please further explain the offerings that have been placed before the altar?
So, yeah, so, you know, one of the things that is important to me around offerings is listening to what the altar is saying is required for the offering. So, so particularly for the one of my grandmother, about my grandmothers and great grandmothers, I certainly had, I had symbolic food because it was in a gallery, but mainly, you know, I had shaved wood for my grandfather, so that the smells of a wood shop were present. It was important to have water, and that water be updated by the gallery. Um, During the artist talk, we did have food offerings, but we were able to kind of take care of that once um, the public program was over. Um, I think particularly with the Chopa Alegwatil, there were toys, popcorn, dice games of chance. There was also the saxophone case of my great uncle was used as a gesture for the casket. Um, so I do use items that are family items. And so I still haven't figured out, other than 3D printing, how to do that if the work needs to travel in a particular way. If I feel insecure about the offerings, I have to meditate or be in some kind of communication, because it means I'm not hearing something and I'm not listening to something. But there's a definite process for me to understand what is required, both of me and of the work.
Thank you. Another question that we received is from Sarah, who asked, who wrote, you mentioned that many of your works are intended to provide you and your ancestors with the opportunity for closure. What do you see as the role of the work's viewers in this process?
Well, the viewer is the offering, not the offerings. The human beings, we are all the offerings for our ancestors. And so for me, the viewer is a descendant of someone potentially who perpetuated that denial, that refusal, that lack of access for my ancestors. And my ancestors also become artists in the sense that their presence evokes the unfinished in the viewer, whether they're conscious of it or not.
The next question we got, how should art historians and art curators approach matters of race, gender, etc., so that they do not speak on behalf of those who live those identities?
Well, artists and curators have their own race, and so they have to speak about their own race and what that means in terms of how they see things, right? So they're having a particular standpoint that they're making meaning from. I also think that issues of power are often ignored in discussing race. And so you cannot talk about race without talking about power dynamics. So that is also the part of the responsibility of the curator and the historian, with including the container of this thing called art history, right? That the container of art history is a power that limits the meaning that we make of art. I also think that we need to understand that we all give a viewpoint, but it isn't the view. So there's another concept in Gestalt that says change occurs when one becomes who he is, not when he tries to be who he is not. And I think curators and art historians, no matter what their race is, that the field itself has been raced, And so there's some work to do to distinguish yourself from the projection of a racial identity on an institution, a field of practice, a role that reinforces and perpetuates ongoing oppression within the art world. That at every level of system, we have raced every element of this thing we call art. We have made objects that are sacred to people or pragmatic to cultures into art as a framework for its removal from a culture or an environment and put into a case or a storage facility, and then made it a privilege to access, in the role of the artist, the object from their own culture.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Anne, another KU Art History graduate student. How does the concept of community play into your installation process? Do you have a set team of people with whom you install your work, or does it change with each project?
My work is relationship based, and so I fail when I work with strangers. And so it's important to me that whoever I work with, that we have a relationship, and that the intention of that relationship is that it lasts over time and that it expands and grows. And so I've had artists who are of, higher note than myself, share their team with me. So the generosity of friendship is important here. But, in my own practice, that team is expanding. Those relationships are in an expanding place right now. So I have a team of about 3 people that I would say are my people. And, some of them may be on listening to this talk right now. So I hope they are here. But I'm very clear that every kind of facet of my work as it grows and transforms, it has to be an investment in building and expanding an understanding that's mutual. And it's really about the invitation. So, part of the reason I'm here and said yes to being here was in the manner in which this organizing team engaged with me.
Well, we of course invite more questions in the chat, but if I may be a little bit selfish, one thing that has come up in the works that you've shared, so generously shared with us, is the idea of the sacred, and you were just speaking about the phenomenon in museums of works with objects with a sacred function in their original context being repurposed and turned into museum collections. And I'd be really curious to know more about the concept of the sacred and the practice of the sacred within your own works and within your own biography, if I may ask.
Well, I've been making altars for over 20 years. And so the process that I do that kind of work in my personal life is very different than how I do it in my art practice. And for me, it's about communicating in a way that is clear between myself and my collaborators, seen and unseen, that this is a public work, that it is a sacred work that is to be engaged with people with varying levels of capacity. And so what are the instructions in that context? And then the other thing for me is The sacred is pragmatic, you know. We project we project and transfer, right, a colonial definition of the sacred onto things. And I think even if you come from a tradition that has kind of pre-Christian ritual life, that we've still been conditioned to be Christian in an American context or in a Western European context. And so part of decolonizing for myself has been to ask myself, am I really taking in a teaching, or am I framing that teaching through a lens that is still Western and Christian, which is different than synchronicity of things, because that becomes a teaching in how to survive and maintain something versus kind of decolonizing and disentangling ourselves from those conditioned messages.
Thank you. David, I think we might be at the end of our questions, but I did want to mention to you, Carmen, just in the chat, we have an overwhelming response of gratitude and some really lovely comments from viewers. And I would like to echo those comments that this was just a really powerful experience, and we're also grateful for you sharing with us today.
No, thank you so much for that feedback, because these kinds of talks, I'm always wondering, is what I'm offering useful? And so that's is important that I have, even if I get one kernel that someone says this is useful, then I'm grateful for that.
Absolutely, Carmen. You've given us so much to think about, reflect on, take seriously. Some of the concepts that you've articulated about healing, about responsibility, about collaboration, about ancestors. You know, I thought a lot about my own grandparents, you know, over the course of your talk. So you, and I'm sure everyone else listening to you has had that similar kind of personal connection with things that you've been saying and values that you've been investing in your work that resonate with us and that are very powerful and healing. I think healing is one of the key concepts that I've taken away. I think that since we're on Zoom and YouTube, and anybody can leave whenever they want, that we would love it if maybe you'd show your video as kind of a final element of this wonderful evening. If you're willing, we're eager to see it.
Yeah, I am willing. However, I'm going to ask both you, David and Rachel, and Mary Frances and Haley, to share one word of impact, because it tends to evoke quite a large feeling in people. So I want to make sure that you all can be a proxy for the audience to close yourselves out of listening to it, you know. So just to give some context, you know, this was a response to not just the murder of George Floyd, but being an artist, sheltering in place, being impacted by the murder of George Floyd. So,
some notes on racism during a global pandemic. Not wearing a mask is the same as putting your knee on my neck in absence of breath. You filthy fucking white people are the plague. And you white queers too have always been the plague. I stand with the Mashpee Wampanoag still. Your addiction to racism, the posting and reposting of snuff, racialized police violence is disgusting. Some of you wear lynched bodies on silver and gold chains. This is not holy. Stop believing that racism is a form of ignorance, and if and only if white people were more educated or trained, the racism would end. Stop sharing resources and not feelings. Feelings are the resource. Whiteness diminishes feelings. White people know. White people invented the resource of racism. They are the nigger. White people derive pleasure out of perpetuating and engaging in racist behaviors. I have witnessed this. You have witnessed this. I have felt their arousal, seen the smirk on their smug pink faces. White women lie. You believe white women's lies. Stop believing the lies of white women. There was no wolf whistle. The gun was a toy. The tail light was not out. She murdered her children. They were emasculated by the sight of a black body jogging. Perhaps the grandmother was a wolf. Some of them jog too, some do not. She ate her granddaughter. She walked into their house, ate their food, slept in their beds. That white cunt slept in their fucking beds. The bears were black. I am Bear Clan. My grandmother was called a nigger by a 2-year-old in a Target at the age of 93. She died at 95. If you do not wear a mask, you want me to die. I am aware of this. White hoods are masks. I'm aware that you are aware. Fuck you. Fuck Karen. Fuck queer Karen. I will not watch another video of a black person being murdered for being a person. I will not watch another video of a black person being murdered for being a person. I will not watch another video of a black person being murdered for being a person. I know. I remember. The purpose of lynching is to remind me and those like me that we are not human. The purpose of allowing a disease to decimate an indigenous community, a community of color, is to remind me and those like me that we are not human. I will stay alive. I will remain human. I will stay alive. I will remain human. I will stay alive. I will remain human.
Thank you, Carmen, for that powerful and necessary work, which has added another dimension, I believe, to our understanding of your practice, your values, the important message that you have to share. Most of all, we appreciate the conversation that this evening has opened up. And I loved how you said you like to perpetuate the relationships, continue the conversation. I hope very much that we'll have the chance to do that.
Yes.
So thank you again. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you for your engagement. We will have 3 more lectures in this series, one each in February, March, and April. We'll be pushing out publicity about those. And in the meantime, we have a lot to think about, to reflect on, and to be grateful for. We're grateful to you, Carmen, for everything you've given us this evening, and we wish you the best.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.